This is Mujib from North Country Kettlebells. Today I'm going to be talking about the Double Kettlebell Push Press and some of the components that go into doing safe and effective Double Kettlebell Push Presses. The Double Kettlebell Push Press is a great movement for training high levels of explosive force as well as overall structural stability. One of the main components of doing the Double Kettlebell Push Press is to make sure that the overhead range of motion feels comfortable on the entire body. So I want to make sure that my shoulders feel comfortable with that overall range of motion. I want to feel comfortable that my torso, my back feels supported, and I don't feel like those kettlebells are folding me back. I really do want to remember that in that overhead position, the shoulders maintain alignment with the hips and the heels the entire time. And so if I can't have that range of motion with my hands directly over my body, then I might want to just go back to a single kettlebell push press, and I might want to work on that overhead range of motion with both hands overhead with either light kettlebells or PVC pipe or something that's going to allow you to maintain that overhead range of motion through your shoulders. But we really want to make sure that those weights are in alignment when they're overhead for that lockout, meaning that I want to have the range of motion comfortable enough to let my hands pull back so that they're directly over my body. As for the rack position when we're doing these double kettlebell push presses, like with most other double kettlebell work, I want to think that I'm going to overlap my hands when I'm in the rack. So not necessarily interlocking the fingers, but overlapping the hands. Now, this is going to allow me to treat the separate weights as if they're a single load. So as I'm doing my dip drive, I want to imagine that those weights being overlapped or my hands being overlapped in the rack position is going to allow my body to treat it as if when I drive that force through my hips, it's going into one single load. Not that if I'm driving that force through my hips with my hands separated, that the force is going to go into two separate objects. So again, I want to think hands at least close to each other, if not fully overlapped. And when I drive that force into those kettlebells, it should go up as if it's one single load. With that said, I want to think that the range of motion of the dip drive is going to happen just by flexing and extending my knees. Remember that we want to think about it as if we're compressing and then rebounding. So I'm just flexing the knees and then fully extending them. But I want to think that that force is coming through my hips themselves and transferring directly into the kettlebells. So the knees flex, the knees extend, and that explosive force pushes through the hips, pushing the kettlebells up off of my body and going all the way to that full lockout overhead. I want to continue to stress the necessity for the strong lockout overhead, for feeling that that stability is the primary focus once we get up overhead. And a good way to think about that when we're doing the double kettlebell push press is to imagine that we're pushing just as much force into the ground as I'm pushing up through the kettlebells. So I want to think that my legs are going to be fully extended, my knees are at full extension, hips are at full extension. I want to think that I'm planting my heels into the ground, I'm pushing down through the arches of my feet and pushing just as much force into the ground as I'm imagining that I'm pushing through the kettlebells. Another component that's going to lead to that strong lockout is going to be the engagement of my abdomen and my glutes. Again, thinking about as if I'm squeezing a quarter with the glutes, and thinking again as if I'm bracing the abdominal wall so as to protect my organs, so that if I was to poke my fingers into my abdominal wall, I couldn't poke past my abdominal muscles. The last component of a solid double kettlebell push press is going to be controlling the descent as you're bringing the weights back to that rack position. Thinking again that I'm not letting those kettlebells drop down, but that I'm actively pulling those kettlebells back to that rack position. We always want to imagine that with the kettlebell overhead, the weight doesn't want to come back down to that front rack position. The weight itself actually wants to go backwards or to the side as it's coming down. So if your arm was to disappear, the weight wouldn't land back here, it would land behind you, essentially. So with the double kettlebell push press, as with all other overhead kettlebell movements where we're going to return to that rack position, we have to actively imagine that we're pulling back to that rack position, almost as if you're doing a chin up or something like that. So I'll dip, I'll drive, I'll go all the way to my lockout with that explosive position, and then I'm going to pull my arms back down to that rack position. I can almost imagine that I'm actually pulling my elbows back to my body and trying to be tight against my body. As with all the rest of our kettlebell movements, when we're first starting out with the double kettlebell push press, I like to say keep the rep counts low, 5 to 8 reps at most. Even 1 to 5 reps can be pretty good when you're first starting to get used to that double weight overhead. You can always do more sets 3 to 5 sets, if not more than that, just to make sure that you're practicing the movement enough. But the main thing is that as you go on in your sets or as you go on in your rep counts, you don't want the movement to start to deteriorate and your form to start to break down. So whatever we need to do to maintain form, whether that's low reps and also low sets, that's what we're gonna do. Try out the double kettlebell push press. Let me know how you feel about that. Always remember that while we're practicing these movements, we're going to be thinking about safety and effectiveness as our primary focuses to have a consistent and a comfortable set every time that we're doing double kettlebell push presses. This is Mujib from North Country Kettlebells talking about the double kettlebell push press.